Hello, welcome to the episode of the Let People Prosper series. My name is Dr. Vanskin. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today is January 5th, 2023. Happy New Year. And we have a great guest today that's been in Texas a long time, has been working on with the Texas legislature on big issues and trying to get policies passed that are pro-liberty, pro-free market, pro-growth, and pro-family at the end of the day. He's a happy warrior, a liberty-minded person overall, and he's none other than James Quintero. James, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
Vance, very kind of you to have me on. Thank you again for allowing me a chance to get into the weeds with you a little bit on what's coming up. I'm very excited about the next 6 months. I think Texas is in a really good position.
Yeah, I think you're right. And that's really why I wanted to have you on the show, along with just being a good friend for a number of years and everything else, just overall a good person. It's great to have you on the program. And this will air on January 10th, which is the first day of the Texas legislative session, which lasts it's 140 days every 2 years. There's a biennial legislature here in Texas, which is where I live, just north of Austin, in a place called Round Rock. But Austin is where the show begins. And so it's really going to get going. We've got some good stuff to talk about today. But before we get into all of that, let me first go ahead and give you his bio for some of you who may not know James. James Quintero is the policy director for the Texas Public Policy Foundation's Government for the People initiative. Having joined the foundation in 2008, Quintero's research covers a wide range of issues, mostly related to local government matters, including taxes, spending, debt, transparency, annexation, and pension reform. He does more than that, but that's a few of them. His work has been featured in the New York Times, Forbes, Fox News, Breitbart, and more. James received an MPA from Texas State University and a BA from the University of Texas at Austin. He is currently seeking a PhD in public policy from Liberty University. He likes torture, apparently. And in 2020, that was not to Liberty University, that was getting a PhD. In 2022, he was appointed to serve a 3-year term on the Commission for Lawyer Discipline. Need more of that. And Quintero and his wife are blessed with 5 beautiful children, a Great Dane, a Boston Terrier, and an exceptionally large grocery bill. So, James, that's a lot of good stuff going on there. We've got a lot to talk about today. So let's get right into it. The first question is, what motivates you, James, to do what you do each and every day?
Well, great question, Vance. My wife used to joke early on in my career that, I needed to serve my time in the conservative movement and then go out and find a quote unquote real job in the private sector where I could earn, a little bit more money. And I always used to tell her that when I felt like I had done what I was here to do, then I would gladly move on and find another job in the private sector. And it just so happens that, 15 years into this particular career, I haven't yet felt like I've fully accomplished what I've set out to do. And fortunately for me, she's kind of stopped asking, and I think she understands that I have a real passion for public policy reform. And I've always kind of had an interest in public service. And so, from my perch here at the foundation, I felt like we've been able to advance some really great ideas centered around life, liberty, and property rights. I'm blessed to be here. I've never not wanted to come to work and be productive. And so, I really have found a job of a lifetime, in my opinion. I love every second of what we do here.
Yeah, and you've done a great job at it, James. I mean, I think you started at PBPF, 2008?
Yeah, so it'll be 15 years in March. This will be my 8th legislative session, and I can tell you, based on that experience, that I have never seen the conservative movement primed for success in the way that it is right now. I think between the composition of the legislature, as well as our fiscal position, as well as, just kind of the general public angst about the status quo. I mean, all of these things are lining up in such a way that Texas is primed to do some major things on virtually every front, right? From taxes to education to local government reform. We are in an excellent position. So I'm very optimistic about what's ahead.
Well, no, I think that's right, James. And I know a lot of that has been from the great work that you've been doing over a number of years. From also one of our mentors, Talmadge Heflin, right? Chairman Talmadge Heflin on appropriations for a number of years. Both of us learned a lot from him of that fiscal hawk nature of not spending as much, keeping taxes low, and those sort of things that have provided an extraordinary opportunity here in Texas. And I mean, in Texas, where we both live, Texas is the 9th largest economy in the world, if you exclude California, which I think we should exclude California.
We should.
Be 10. We beat. Let's say we're in the top 10, regardless. But that's an amazing situation when you think about there's 30 million people that live in Texas. Okay, about 10% of the population, but you're talking about a massive economy that's continuing to grow. It's dynamic. It's diversified. Back in the 1980s, a big portion of the economy was oil and gas, about a quarter was just oil and gas. Now that's closer to 1 out of every 10% is oil and gas. So it's diversified a lot in business and healthcare. A lot of different sectors have come in, and technology has been a new one here in Central Texas around the Austin area. And it's part of this Texas model. What do you see as the Texas model of really bringing more business and people and everything? We also know, James, as our drives and our commute show, there's a lot more traffic. What's going on in Texas that's really making it that way?
Wow, great questions. I think you're right to highlight the Texas model, which is steeped in this idea that low taxes and limited government breed success, right? And the state in particular, state government has done an excellent job of hewing towards this conservative perspective and enacting policies that really further that philosophical view. And so as a result, we've had tremendous growth in population, income, interest. I mean, it's just Texas is really the spot you want to be. And of course, that invites challenges. That's not to say we don't have challenges, but these are challenges that you associate with success, not failure. And so, I think the future of the Lone Star State is bright, assuming that we continue to hew very closely to that line that we've already established. I don't have a similar sentiment with respect to the national government. I look to Washington, D.C., and I think it's fundamentally broken, not just as a political institution, but fiscally, morally, and in some other ways. I really do have tremendous fear for where this nation is headed in the not too distant future. Hopefully I'm proven wrong, but I don't see how we get out of the ditch that we're currently in. So we're kind of in this unique position where we are in the best state in the greatest country, and I think we're primed for lots of success here in Texas. But from a national perspective, I'm not sure what the future holds, but I'm a little pessimistic on it.
Well, I'm a little bit more than just a little pessimistic. I think there's a lot going on in DC that is not a good situation at all. I mean, James, that I worked in the White House for about a year in President Trump's administration and the Office of Management and Budget. We had a budget that I helped write that had $4.6 trillion in savings over a decade. Of course, Congress didn't listen. They continued to spend more and pass more. Then COVID hit. That ramped up the deficit even further. Over $7 trillion has been added to the national debt just in the last 3 years. Right, a massive amount of money. Maybe some of the early parts of that were appropriate given the pandemic and everything else. I don't know that it should have been as high as it was and all that. But you've seen a situation now where all this massive spending has happened, and then the Federal Reserve went through and printed a lot of that money so that interest rates wouldn't go up. And there's no wonder that we have persistent inflation, even though a lot of economists tried to call it transitory inflation for so long. But all these issues have now also influenced the states, because we have this system of federalism, which I think was genius, part of the American founders, right? And we should have state sovereignty, which those limited things that aren't at the federal level should be left to the states and to the people. And that's where individual liberty and prosperity really comes from. And too often government continues to crowd out not only the private sector, but also crowd out what the states are able to do or local governments are able to do. And the inflation that we see across the United States, given what's happening in DC, is influencing people all across the great state of Texas, to where, in fact, I think we're in an affordability crisis. Even a lot of the good things have happened over the last, let's say, decade of passing conservative Texas budgets by the state legislature, of some reforms to property taxes, which we'll get into here in a little bit. But some of those things I think have helped to rein in some of that excess. But at the same time, we're facing an affordability crisis. And I know that you've looked at this in the form of local debt, local property taxes. What do you see as really hurting families across this great state?
Yeah, great question, man. So, first off, I too have been encouraged by the resurgence of federalism. I think that's, perhaps one of the greatest takeaways of the last few years is that, we've seen this kind of the emphasis shift towards states' rights and state sovereignty. And I think we're going to be the beneficiaries of that for a long time to come. When it comes to the affordability crisis, this is a multi-headed beast. And I think there are lots of places to put the blame, but the place where I would put it the most is at the local government level. And what I mean here in Texas is, you of course have a property tax system which is exclusively administered at the local level. Your various local taxing entities will adopt the tax rates, they determine the budgets, they figure out how much to squeeze you. And so, when it comes to our property tax problem, it's dominated by your local elected officials, even though they like to point the blame at the legislature and say it's the legislature's fault that we're having to tax you as much as we are. I don't subscribe to that particular viewpoint. And of course, this problem has only become more pronounced in recent years with the level of valuation increases that we've seen. Last year alone, there was a report that said, on a statewide basis, property owners had experienced somewhere between a 20 to 50% year over year valuation increase, and which means that our property values have exploded last year. And taxing entities, for their part, did not reduce their tax rates in commensurate fashion. Right? They didn't bring those rates down to compensate for how fast values were growing, which means at the end of the day, property tax payers were paying more. And so, this big problem that we all had grew much worse last year. And I think there's a lot more eyes looking at the legislature this session for tax relief than in years past. But of course, taxes are just one element of the affordability crisis, where I think local governments have really screwed the pooch, for the lack of a better term, is on land use. Yeah. They impose all sorts of onerous housing regulations on both builders and consumers alike that really drive up the cost of purchasing a house. One of the things that we're going to be looking to do in this next legislative session is working with some coalition partners with a group called Texans for Reasonable Solutions to advance some very common sense ideas, like, eliminating minimum lot size requirements, or at least easing them, allowing for third-party inspections by credentialed professionals to ease some of the permit delays that have kind of infested the system. And we've got, a few other ideas as well. We're going to be trying to effectively get our hands around this local government overregulation environment and allow people to the ability to engage in the building and development process in easier fashion, with the hopes that will increase supply and alleviate some of the affordability crisis. And so, between taxes and regulations, I think those are two very big ways that local governments in Texas in particular are contributing to that affordability problem. There's a few other ways, but I don't want to bore your listeners by getting too far in the weeds.
Well, no. I mean, this is what a lot of listeners are already feeling, right? Whether they're here in Texas or in other states, they've seen their home values go up tremendously, which I think helps us as those of us who own a home now. Our equity is rising. But if we wanted to sell and cash out on that equity, where are we going to go next, right? You probably got to downsize or something like that, given the housing prices and how far they've went up. And going back to DC, I think a lot of this kind of quote unquote boom has been because of the low interest rate environment that the Federal Reserve has been able to manipulate the markets, whether it be the housing market or some other markets. You've created too much demand that's gone around. And in places like Texas, where people are leaving, right? California, New York, and others, and some recent data by the Census Bureau shows that, Texas is one of the top 5. If you look at total number of people moving to Texas from other states on net, it's number 2. 2 to only Florida, which also has a lot of good conservative values there. But per 100,000 people, Texas in the top 5, but the ones that are at the bottom are, your Californias and New York. People are leaving those progressive, high spending, high tax, high regulation places and moving to the places that have low spending, lower taxes, and less regulation, exactly to your point. And whenever you think about Texas as being this sea of red, if you think about Republicans versus Democrats, it's this sea of red with a lot of blueberries. When you think about Austin and Dallas and Houston, a lot of the Democrat-controlled areas where you really see the driving force of increased government spending. You and I actually did some papers on these here recently. And how would you say is the excessive spending is connected then to the higher taxes that we're paying, and not only here in Texas, but across the country, especially when it comes at the local level?
Yeah, I think Dr. Arthur Laffer said it best: spending is taxation. So for every dollar that, my beloved city of Austin or Austin ISD or Travis County spends, it's got to take from someone else first. And usually that's in the form of property taxes. But of course, we know it's not just property taxes alone. Local governments have many different revenue sources. And this year in particular, we saw lots of fees, fines, and other revenue streams increase because of some of the work that we actually did here at the foundation. Back in 2019, we helped the legislature enact some relatively stringent property tax revenue limitations that put a 3.5% limit on cities, counties, and certain special districts, and a 2.5% revenue limitation on school districts. Now, as a result of kind of trying to control for excessive property tax increases, what a lot of local governments have done to keep their spending levels elevated is they've just found the money elsewhere, right? And so that's one of the reasons that we're asking the legislature to consider comprehensive local spending limits that will better control for the rate of local spending. And by the way, this isn't some totally unfounded idea that we pulled out of a hat. The state is currently governed by at least 4 different spending limits. And so really what we're asking for is local governments to be governed by the very same mechanism that controls for state government growth right now. And I think that's a very reasonable proposition. One of the things with respect to urban areas in particular, one of the ways that I know that the property tax crisis is really hurting families in particular is if you look at the enrollment rates in your various school districts. Austin ISD, I'm most familiar with because, of course, I'm here. Austin has suffered from persistent enrollment decline, and I would say at least 6 out of the last 8 years, enrollment has hit a wall, and this district is hemorrhaging students. And what this tells me is that property taxes have become so pronounced that families are pulling out of the urban area and they're retreating either to the suburbs or to the rural areas for affordability reasons. And you see this trend not just in Austin ISD, but all across the state, in Houston, Dallas, I think San Antonio to some extent, where families are pulling out of your urban centers and heading for higher ground. And so, what that's doing is it's changing the composition of those who live in your urban centers. And I think that's to the detriment of Texas's future. A good city will have a mix of a wide demographic. And right now we're seeing Texas cities in some ways change into something reminiscent of California cities. And of course, we all know where that leads, nowhere good. And so, we have a strong interest here at the foundation in perpetuating good fiscal policy, not just because it's good for your pocketbooks, but also because there are long-term consequences for how this state grows and what it looks like in the future.
Yeah, no, great points there, James. Well said. I think that is really important about having those local spending limits. One of the gold standards in spending limits has been Colorado's Taxpayer Bill of Rights. Colorado's TABOR is what it's called. And it was based on covering general revenue at the state level based on population growth plus inflation. That would be the increases over time, which is a reasonable measure of the average taxpayer's ability to pay for government spending. But what's interesting about Colorado was that it also covered the locals. And it was the state and the locals that were covered underneath that limit. And what they would do is if you had any surplus, they would send that surplus back because Colorado has a personal income tax. They would send that in the form of rebate checks out to all the people. Now, that has costs and benefits because it's also increased some dependency on government when you start having those checks. But at least there was a mechanism in place to say, you know what, we're going to limit spending and we're going to use the surplus to send back to the people in the process. And that's been weakened over time. Colorado's TABOR isn't as strong as what it used to be. They've, excluded parts of general revenue and things of that nature. And so it has been reduced some over time. But I think that's where Texas is moving into now, is that in 2021, there was a stronger spending limit that was put in place, covered more of the budget, all general revenue. The growth rate is based now on population growth times inflation, kind of this compound method compared to just plus, but they're pretty close overall. They increased to exceed the limit, to bust the limit to a 3/5 vote. That's one of the spending limits that's out there now. And I think the point is here is why not just make that over to the local levels as well? And then that could maybe find a way to reduce property taxes. I know that's something else that you've been trying to work on, James. What are some of the key things that you've been looking at when in lowering property taxes in Texas?
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Vance. So for as much of a challenging fiscal environment that we have at the local level, I think, again, the state is primed to do some big things to try and get a handle on the situation. And here's an example. As it stands right now, the legislature will have a $27 billion general revenue surplus available for tax relief purposes if it wanted to, right? And that's just as it stands right now because there are rumors swirling that the comptroller is going to come out here in the not too distant future and actually make it known that the state has an even larger general revenue surplus than it originally anticipated. And so you couple that $27 billion in GR surplus with the $14 billion that's also expected in the state's quote unquote savings account. And you see that there is ample revenue to do something truly transformational, assuming the political will exists. Now, assuming it does, and I'm very optimistic on it, then we have a once in a lifetime chance to fundamentally change Texas's tax system for the better. And the way that the foundation is going about it is we are asking the legislature to dedicate a large amount of that surplus, as much as 90%, to buy down the school district maintenance and operations tax rate, which is a really boring way of saying the biggest part of your tax bill. And we don't want to do it in a one-time fashion. We want the legislature to not only compress the rates, but permanently compress the rates, right? And what we're trying to do is use this huge slug of money to eventually walk us down the path where there is no longer a school district M&O tax rate, where we've taken that completely off of taxpayers' plates and it's now housed at the legislative level. And by doing so, you get a couple of different things, right? You get tax relief that is immediate and long-lasting. You effectively required the legislature to use surplus funds for tax relief purposes instead of growing government, which we all very much hate. And then you also get rid of this really pernicious system called Robin Hood, which is this progressive redistributionist scheme enacted in the mid-1990s by Governor Ann Richards. It's a terrible system. It just doesn't work. And you would totally shelve that if and when you got to the point where the M&O tax were done away with. So that's just one idea that we're working on that I think if the legislature seizes on it, would really change Texas for the better.
I think that's right. And, I've done a lot of research on this as well. And I think that when you talk to a lot of people who aren't in Texas, the first things that come up are, well, the school districts are local. Why is the state getting involved with local taxes and local spending overall? And then another question that I've, kind of heard is how can you make sure that it is maintained, that you're able to keep those property taxes compressed? Because if valuations go up, then that means that unless you put more money towards it, you're going to have higher rates in the process. And this might create a situation where you buy down the rate for a temporary period of time, and then they just come back up. What do you say to those types of questions?
Good question. So to the first one, I would say, we have to recognize that local governments or political subdivisions are arms of the state. They are creatures of the state, and they exist to fulfill legislative purposes. And so, I think it's important to remember that they are not autonomous. They do not exist in a vacuum. They are creatures of the state, and the legislature has every right to get involved with local matters where it does. Now, the second thing that I'd mention, though, is that the state is already involved in school finance, right? The legislature provides about 40%, I believe it's 40 to 45% of most school district funding right now. And really what we would be asking to do is simply to allow the legislature to engage in a greater, to bear a greater share of that burden, and ultimately get to 100%, right? To your second question, it's a very good question. And I think the answer is this. One, the legislature is going to have to enact a set of rules and requirements that disallows school districts from raising the M&O rate beyond that zero measure if and when it gets to that point. It's going to be very important. And it's going to be more difficult than it sounds, because you have a very powerful education lobby on the other side that is constantly advocating for more money and more control. And, the legislature is going to have to stay focused and drive those rates down to zero with no allowance for ISDs to go above that. I think in the ideal, the other part of that is they'll still retain a certain measure of control under our ideal, because you have something called the interest in sinking tax rate, or the INS rate, which allows for voters in those communities to vote for big fancy stadiums, Taj Mahal facilities, AstroTurf, electronic billboards, whatever the community thinks is needed in those instances. And of course, I'm being a little sarcastic, but that INS tax rate allows for school districts and communities to come together and to self-impose a property tax if voters agree. And so, there is still a measure of local control that will be retained under our ideal plan.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think that's well said there, James. I know something else that we had worked on for a number of years, but there's not necessarily the political will yet, is to figure out a way to broaden the sales tax base. There's a lot of exemptions that are there. Just broaden it, make it sound tax policy is the broadest base with the lowest rate possible. And if you did that, then you could eliminate the school M&O property tax without even having to raise the rate. With dynamic forecasting and the economy growing faster and everything else, would be an extraordinary opportunity. Because I think you're exactly right. At least here in Texas, the state is the one that determines the school finance formulas. So why not just go ahead and put it on them 100% instead of having it to where it seems like that the local ISDs are really controlling the amount of funding. It's really being controlled primarily by the state legislature. So it puts it back to where it belongs, I guess, or at least within the Constitution, what they're confined to do. And I think either going about it by broadening the base and doing it overnight would be one way, and then using surplus dollars in the future to buy down other taxes, maybe the sales taxes. But I think this approach of using surpluses where spending is the priority, spending is the ultimate burden of government, right? Where you limit that, use surplus funds to buy down this school M&O property tax. You could do it in about a decade. And Texas already doesn't have a personal income tax. One of 9 states to not have a personal income tax, which is one reason why I think the Texas model is so strong and people are moving here. What if we didn't have half the property tax either? I mean, that would be an extraordinary opportunity for growth, for people, for families to really be able to prosper overall. And speaking of prosper, our last couple of minutes here, James, what do you think about the future? What's going to be the best opportunities from a policy perspective that would allow for us to be as prosperous as possible to really let people prosper?
Right. Well, good question. So, I'm very bullish on the property tax issue. I think there's a lot working on our favor. Above and beyond that, I really see perhaps the movement best positioned for school choice. And I've seen this issue come about, a time or two in the past. But really, this movement towards parental empowerment is as strong and is as primed for success as I've ever seen. You have state leadership who's out there vocally sounding the alarm. You have a lot of the legislature who has also signaled that they are ready for action. You have terrorists, or should I say parents, engaged parents, who also want to see big changes come about. And so,
that was a joke for the audience, by the way, because some of the parents were called terrorists because they were for school choice. All right,
that's right. They had this wild idea that they should get involved at the school board level. And as a result, you had these publicly funded associations like TASB and NSBA come out and lambast these parents and accuse them of some sort of domestic terrorism. And so, they had the gall for getting engaged, and now they're labeled as a result. But,
yeah.
I think there's a lot of energy out there. And I will also say it's not just in Texas. You have a lot of other conservative states that are doing big things to empower parents. And so I really do have a lot of hope for the school choice movement in 2023.
Well, those are wise words, James. Thank you for all that you do. Thank you for your continuing push for individual liberty, for prosperity, for pro-growth policies overall. I mean, you've been doing it for more than a decade. You're also a great family man, a good godly man as well. And I just really appreciate you, not only as a person, but also as your policy choices and just, watching you along the way, man. You're doing a great job, and keep up the Lord's work. God bless you and your family. And for the audience, this is episode 26. We got a lot more episodes to go. If you would, please rate us as a 5-star wherever you're listening to this. We've got a lot more good episodes coming up. And with that, I hope that you have a wonderful day and let people prosper.